On the night of April 10th, 1834, rescuers broke down a locked door on the upper floor of one of New Orleans' most admired mansions and found something that made grown men walk back out into the hallway and stand there, not speaking, realizing that the most prestigious house in the city was actually a tomb. The woman who owned that mansion was already gone. She had slipped out during the chaos, crossed Lake Pontchartrain to the North Shore, and disappeared long enough for the city's rage to burn itself down. Eventually, she made her way to Mobile, and from Mobile, she crossed the Atlantic. She would never come back. She would never be charged. She would die in France years later, and New Orleans would spend the next 2 centuries trying to decide what to call her. For most of the last 2 centuries, the world has been content to call this a ghost story. It's the version that sells, the haunted mansion, the flickering lights, the figure seen in the upper window. But the account the New Orleans be published within days of that fire, built from the testimony of men who climbed those stairs themselves, doesn't need any of that. It holds its own weight. The mansion at 1140 Royal Street told you everything about Delphine Lalaurie before you ever met her. 3 stories of solid plastered brick on one of the most prominent streets in the French Quarter. A private carriageway leading back to a shielded courtyard. Inside, chandeliers, imported silk, silver that caught the candlelight in rooms designed to make guests feel they had arrived somewhere that mattered. She had been born Delphine McCarty around 1787 into a family with the kind of name that worked like a pass in every courtroom and drawing room in the city, the kind of standing that meant a governor thought twice before declining an invitation, that meant people who noticed things happening behind that carriageway gate also noticed who owned it and adjusted their calculations accordingly. By the time she settled into Royal Street with her 3rd husband, she had already buried 2 previous ones and spent decades learning precisely how influence moved through New Orleans. The house was the physical expression of that learning. Governors came to her table, judges, writers and merchants, and anyone who wanted to belong to New Orleans in the fullest sense. She was charming in a specific way. She remembered names, asked questions that landed right, laughed at the right moments. Her guests left feeling the evening had been exceptional. None of them, as far as the record shows, looked carefully at the people who served their wine and then disappeared back through the door at the edge of the room. The people who actually lived inside that house were carrying a completely different set of facts. Neighbors on Royal Street had been noticing things for years. The enslaved people in the Lalaurie household moved differently than those in other houses on the block. Quietly, watchfully, with eyes that checked a room before the rest of the face had time to settle. Faces would simply stop appearing, replaced without comment or explanation. One woman who lived nearby noticed enough that she eventually made the walk to the local authorities. Think about what that walk felt like. Passing the mansion's tall windows, knowing what she suspected was happening behind them, feeling the full weight of the fact that her silence had been part of what allowed it to continue. She reached the authorities and told them what she'd seen and what she feared. The man who heard her out explained, with the patience of someone used to having this conversation, that there was nothing he could do. Louisiana law at that time didn't recognize the people behind that gate as people in the legal sense. They were property. What happened to property on private land was not a matter the courts were structured to question. She walked home. She had to go on living on the same block, passing the same gate, carrying all of it with nowhere left to take it. Then came the incident with the girl. She appears in the New Orleans Bee's records. Her name in some accounts is Leah. She was young, 7 or 8 years old, and she worked as a personal attendant to Madame Lalaurie. One afternoon, she was brushing her mistress's hair when the brush caught a knot and she pulled too hard. Lalaurie reached for a whip. The girl ran through the house, up one staircase, and then the next, floor by floor, until there was no more house above her. Only the roof and the courtyard far below. She was more frightened of what was behind her than of the distance down. She went over the edge. A fine was levied against Lalaurie, a small one, and then, through the legal maneuvering that her family name made available to her, the enslaved people briefly seized by authorities were returned to her possession. The same law that had told the neighbor there was nothing to be done now handed them back. After that, the faces that appeared from the Lalaurie household were harder to look at directly. Thinner, moving with the specific economy of people who have learned that drawing attention is its own kind of risk. Neighbors kept talking quietly among themselves. The dinner parties continued. The invitations kept going out, and the carriages kept arriving. Until the evening of April 10th, 1834. The kitchen was in a separate outbuilding at the back of the property, a standard arrangement for wealthy New Orleans households designed to keep cooking fires away from the main structure. On most evenings, the distance between that outbuilding and the rest of Royal Street felt like a different world entirely. The woman who worked that kitchen, we don't know her name. The historical record didn't preserve it, and that absence is its own kind of statement. What we know is that she was approximately 70 years old. She had been in the Lalaurie household long enough that nothing about it was new to her. She knew which floorboards creaked on the upper floors. She knew the exact sound a particular lock made when it turned. She knew the sounds that filtered down through the building after dark, the ones that everyone else in the French Quarter had found ways to ignore. She worked in the heat of that kitchen, fire going, iron range running hot the way it did every evening. The smoke from the wood collected near the ceiling before it found its way out. The smells of rendered fat and char. The buildings settling around her the way old buildings do in the Louisiana heat, would expanding the particular quiet of a house at night when the guests are gone and the surface the house shows the world has been put away. And then you see it, what nobody outside that kitchen had reason to know about until the fire made it impossible to ignore any longer. She was chained to the stove, not metaphorically, not as a condition of labor. A chain, physically restraining a 70-year-old woman to the range she cooked on. She had been working like this long enough that the chain was no longer a shock to her. It had become simply the shape her days took. The heat, the sound from upstairs, the chain. On the evening of April 10th, she decided that was finished. She set the kitchen on fire herself, deliberately. Whether this was a calculated move, a decision that the only way to force the outside world to look inside these walls was to give it no choice, or whether she had simply reached the point past which endurance stops being something a person chooses, we can't know. Probably both were true at once. What the record tells us is that the fire spread fast, that smoke rose above the roofline and became visible on Royal Street, and that word moved through the surrounding blocks with the speed that comes when a neighborhood has been half expecting something. People ran toward the mansion. Some came to help. Some came because a fire on a prominent street pulls a crowd before anyone decides to form one. They poured through the carriageway into the courtyard. Delphine Lalaurie and her family came out of the main house. When men in the crowd asked for the keys to the upper floors, to check for trapped people, to see how far the fire had spread, she said no. No panique. No explanation. Just refusal. They went up anyway. The New Orleans Bee's reporter spoke directly to the men who climbed those stairs. 7 enslaved people were found in those rooms, chained, some secured to walls, some to iron fixtures embedded in the floor. The conditions made clear they had been confined there not for days, but far longer. They were severely malnourished. What the reporter described was the visible evidence of what Lalaurie had done. Not in a single incident, not as punishment for a specific act, but as something ongoing and sustained across an extended period. Marks that accumulated, wounds in different stages, the physical record of a locked room, and a deliberate choice made repeatedly over time. Some accounts from the period described more extreme specifics, and historians have been careful, rightly, to note that embellishment grows around notorious cases and that the most extreme claims are hardest to verify against primary sources. What is verified across multiple independent contemporaneous reports? 7 people, chained and starved, bearing the visible evidence of her cruelty, in a locked room, in a house where New Orleans' most prominent men had been coming to dinner for years. Word hit the crowd outside and changed it into something else. Windows went first. Then the ironwork came down from the balconies. Furniture was dragged into Royal Street. The chandeliers, the silk, the pieces that had crossed an ocean to furnish those rooms, and destroyed on the pavement. Nobody was taking anything. They were trying to tear down the house, because the woman who built it was no longer there to face them, because she was already gone. At some point during the fire and the chaos surrounding it, a carriage had moved out of the property. Some witnesses described her leaving with the composure of someone who had thought about this moment before it arrived. Others described speed. What every account agrees on is direction. Away from Royal Street, away from the city, eventually across the lake to the North Shore, where she and her family stayed out of sight long enough for the immediate danger to recede. From there, Mobile. From Mobile, the Atlantic crossing to France. The detailed paper trail that had documented her New Orleans life, marriage records, property transfers, society notices, goes uncertain and thin after that. Fragments exist. A possible death notice in a French-language publication, a burial record some historians have connected to her name, account from people who said they had seen her in Paris in the years following. Nothing solid enough to reconstruct her final years clearly. She died in France, probably in the early 1840s. Exact circumstances, unknown. No extradition. No charges. No trial. She died free. The 7 people found in those rooms on April 10th, 1834. What became of them is almost entirely unrecorded. In the immediate aftermath, they were brought to the city jail, not as prisoners, but because it was one of the few places with capacity to receive them while the city's response organized. They were placed on public view. People came in numbers. Donations were made. The newspaper coverage was, for its era and place, unusually direct about both the facts and the person responsible. After those first days, near silence. A few names surface in the earliest accounts. Most vanish into the same gap that swallowed the documented histories of enslaved people across antebellum Louisiana. Untracked, unarchived, absorbed into a record that was constructed around a different class of people and was never going to hold them. Delphine Lalaurie has a Wikipedia page, a thoroughly documented social biography, and a house with her name attached that appears in guidebooks and television series and tours. The people she harmed are mostly nameless. That's not a coincidence or a failure of the archive. It's the same structural logic that protected her while she was alive, still operating in the documents she left behind. The mansion itself moved through its decades carrying its history attached, whether new owners wanted that or not. It became a school, then apartments, a music conservatory, a bar. Nicolas Cage bought it in 2007 and lost it to foreclosure in 2009. American Horror Story filmed scenes there in 2013. It gets photographed every day by tourists on Royal Street, who may or may not know the full weight of what they're framing. The ghost tours stop in front of it at night. The guides lower their voices and describe the hauntings. Sounds without sources, figures in the upper windows, a spirit named Warwick said to wander the floors. Warwick doesn't appear in the 1834 newspaper accounts. He's not in the eyewitness testimony from the days following the fire. He's a figure who entered the story much later, through the folklore that grows around infamous locations across generations. The documented victims found in those rooms were not folklore. The New Orleans Bee reporter who described what those men found when they broke down that door was not writing a ghost story. Warwick is what this story becomes when people are more comfortable with a haunting than with the actual history. The actual history doesn't need a ghost to be disturbing. What it needs is to be looked at straight. Delphine Lalaurie was not a supernatural figure, and she was not some isolated aberration operating outside her society. She was produced by it. The system around her told her, through every law and institution and social arrangement, that the people she was harming were her property and therefore her private concern. Her neighbors hit a wall when they tried to act. A child died in her courtyard, and the legal response was a fine followed by the return of her enslaved people to her care. The judges who might have investigated were the same men who ate at her table. The law that might have protected the people in those rooms was the same law that kept handing them back to her. The fire was not the solution to any of that. It was a crack in it, one moment when the outside world could no longer look away because someone had made looking away impossible. The mob that tore apart the mansion that night was real, and the anger behind it was real, But neither of those things changed the legal structure that had made the LaLaurie mansion possible. That structure continued. That is its own long story. But on April 10th, 1834, a woman whose name the record didn't bother to keep made a decision inside a burning kitchen that changed what happened next. She knew the floorboards that creaked. She knew the exact click of that lock turning. She had heard, for however long the chain had been on her, everything that filtered down through that house at night. She had more specific knowledge of what was happening inside 1140 Royal Street than any neighbor, any authority, any dinner guest who had ever sat at that table. And she set the fire anyway, knowing she might not survive it, knowing the building might come down around her, knowing that 70 years of a life spent in a world that hadn't seen fit to protect her had left her with one remaining option that might actually work. It worked. Without her, those doors stay locked. Those 7 people stay in those rooms. The carriages keep arriving on Royal Street, and the invitations keep going out, and New Orleans keeps looking at the beautiful surface of that house and deciding not to look any further. She forced the world to look. The record didn't even keep her name. There is no justice in this story. There is only a fire, a locked door, and the woman who finally made the city see what was behind it.